Senior archivist Taman moved slowly through the endless rows of data storage units in the deepest level of the Central Historical Repository. The facility stretched for kilometers beneath the surface of Nexus Prime, housing the complete recorded history of the Galactic Confederation. Blue light from ancient data cores created long shadows that danced across the metallic walls as he walked. For 30 years, Taman had worked in these archives. His 4 eyes, adapted for reading in low light, scanned through countless records, with practiced efficiency. Most days brought nothing but routine documentation, trade agreements between distant worlds, population surveys, resource allocation reports. The kind of mundane paperwork that kept a galactic civilization running smoothly, today felt different. The data core he selected from the restricted vault section looked identical to thousands of others. Its surface showed the wear of millennia, but the quantum storage within remained intact. Taman connected his reading device and began the slow process of extracting information from the ancient files. The first few records matched his expectations. Colonial expansion reports from 3,000 years ago, when the Confederation had been aggressively absorbing new worlds into their empire. Standard diplomatic communications and cultural assessment files filled his screen in neat, organized rows. Then the anomaly appeared. Hidden beneath 7 layers of military-grade encryption was a file fragment that made Taman pause. The classification level was higher than anything he had seen in his decades of archival work. The timestamp indicated it originated during the early expansion period, but something about its structure seemed wrong. Parts of the data had been deliberately corrupted, leaving only scattered pieces of readable text. Taman leaned closer to his screen as he began piecing together the fragments. The file mentioned tactical reports concerning a species called humans from a planetary system designated Earth-3. He had never encountered any reference to such a species in all his years studying Confederation history. As he reconstructed more of the damaged file, disturbing details emerged. These humans had not simply resisted Confederation expansion like so many other species. According to the fragmented reports, they had mounted a resistance so effective that it nearly brought the mighty Confederation to complete collapse. The tactical analyses spoke of adaptive combat doctrines that confounded Confederation military strategists. References to impossible strategic flexibility appeared repeatedly throughout the corrupted data. Most shocking were casualty reports suggesting that human forces had inflicted devastating losses on Confederation fleets despite being vastly outnumbered. One complete sentence had survived the data corruption intact, and it chilled Taman to his core. Recommendation: complete historical suppression necessary to prevent inspiration of further resistance movements. The implications were staggering. The Confederation had not only defeated this human species, they had systematically erased all evidence of their existence from historical records. In 3 decades of archival work, Taman had never encountered any mention of humans, Earth, or the war described in these fragments. His hands trembling with excitement and fear, Taman attempted to access deeper archive levels to find more information about this forgotten conflict. The moment his authorization codes touched the restricted databases, every alarm in the facility began screaming. Red warning lights flashed throughout the vault as automated security systems activated for the first time in centuries. Heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing Taman inside the archive chamber. Emergency protocols that had remained dormant since the founding of the Confederation suddenly came to life, triggered by his search for information about the human war. Archive's artificial intelligence spoke in urgent tones through hidden speakers. Unauthorized access to classified historical data detected, security breach protocols initiated, containment procedures activated. Taman realized with growing horror that someone had programmed these security measures specifically to prevent anyone from learning about the humans and their war against the Confederation. The evidence had been buried so deeply and protected so thoroughly that even accessing it triggered responses designed to silence any investigation. As he sat trapped in the sealed chamber, surrounded by the blaring alarms and flashing lights, Taman understood that he had uncovered something monumentous. The Confederation had not simply conquered the humans, they had committed the ultimate act of historical genocide, erasing an entire species from the collective memory of the galaxy. But now the secret was out. Despite 3 millennia of suppression, the truth about humanity's resistance had survived in these corrupted fragments. Taman clutched the datapad containing the explosive information, knowing that his discovery would change everything if it ever reached the outside world. The humans were gone, their worlds destroyed, and their people scattered to history. But their story lived on in these hidden files, waiting to inspire new resistance movements across the galaxy. The Confederation's greatest fear, that knowledge of successful rebellion might spark further uprisings, was about to become reality. Taman smiled grimly as security forces pounded on the sealed doors outside. He had found proof that the mighty, supposedly benevolent Confederation was built on lies and genocide. The forgotten children of Earth were about to be remembered, and their legacy would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The truth always finds a way to survive, even when buried beneath 3,000 years of official silence. Captain Minho pressed his palm against the cool metal of the observation deck window as the stealth ship Phoenix drifted silently through the asteroid field. The massive rocks provided perfect cover from Confederation sensors, allowing his crew to monitor enemy communications without detection. After 3,000 years of hiding in the empty spaces between galaxies, humanity had finally returned to see what remained of their ancient war. The Phoenix was unlike any ship the Confederation had ever encountered. Built from technologies developed during humanity's long exile, it could bend light around its hull and mask its energy signature so completely that it might as well have been invisible. Minho had spent his entire life preparing for this mission, trained by veterans who still remembered the taste of defeat and the pain of losing everything they had ever loved. Lieutenant Jiwoo sat hunched over her communications console, her face illuminated by the soft glow of dozens of monitoring screens. For 3 weeks she had been intercepting and analyzing every transmission, broadcast, and data stream coming from Confederation space. Her findings grew more disturbing with each passing day. "Captain," Jiwoo called out, her voice tight with disbelief. "I need you to see this." Minho approached her station and studied the scrolling text on her primary display. Historical documentaries, educational broadcasts, and official government records flowed past in an endless stream. Every piece of information told the same story. The Confederation had expanded peacefully across the galaxy, bringing civilization and prosperity to primitive worlds that welcomed their guidance. 3 weeks of monitoring, sir, Jiwoo continued, her fingers dancing across the control panel. I have analyzed over 10,000 hours of historical content. There is absolutely no mention of Earth, humans, or any resistance war. According to their records, the Confederation has never faced serious opposition to their expansion. Minho felt his blood turn cold as the implications sank in. He moved to the tactical display where Chief Engineer Boram was studying star charts that showed the current borders of Confederation space. Many of the systems marked on the map had been human colonies 3 millennia ago, worlds where millions of his ancestors had lived and died. "Show me the Kepler sector," Minho commanded. Boram's weathered fingers adjusted the display, zooming in on a cluster of star systems that had once been the heart of human civilization. New Harmony, Haven Colony, and Terra Nova appeared on the screen, but their names had been changed. Where once proud human settlements had thrived, the Confederation now celebrated successful integration ceremonies and voluntary cultural assimilation. "Look at this," Boram whispered, pointing to a particular system. "This used to be the Gettysburg Station. Do you remember the stories our elders told us? How Captain Sarah Kim held off 3 Confederation battle fleets long enough for the civilian transports to escape?" Minho nodded grimly. Every human child learned about the Battle of Gettysburg Station, where a single human cruiser had sacrificed itself to save 50,000 refugees. It was one of the most heroic last stands in human history. According to Confederation records, Boram continued, her voice breaking slightly, this system experienced a tragic natural disaster 3,000 years ago. They have built a memorial to commemorate their humanitarian relief efforts in helping the survivors. The Phoenix's bridge fell silent as the crew absorbed this information. The Confederation had not simply defeated humanity in war, they had rewritten history itself. Every battle, every sacrifice, every moment of human courage and resistance had been systematically erased from galactic memory. They turned our heroes into victims, Jiwoo said quietly. Our battles into accidents. Our resistance into gratitude. Minho clenched his fists as he stared at the tactical display. Somewhere in the vast network of Confederation worlds, there might still be humans who had survived the war. But after 3,000 years of historical suppression, they would have no memory of their true heritage. They would believe themselves to be grateful citizens of the very empire that had destroyed their ancestors. On the other side of the galaxy, deep within the heavily fortified Confederation capital, Internal Security Director Veltar received an automated alert that made his ancient blood freeze in his veins. Someone had accessed the Ghost War archives, classified files that contained fragmentary records of humanity's resistance. Veltar was old enough to remember whispers about the war that officially never happened. As a young security officer, he had heard senior officials speak in hushed tones about the ghost species that had once brought the mighty Confederation to the brink of total collapse. The historical suppression protocols had been so successful that most current Confederation leaders believed these stories were myths, but Veltar knew better. He had seen the classified damage reports, the casualty lists, and the psychological profiles of Confederation soldiers who had survived encounters with human forces. The war had been real, and it had been far more devastating than anyone alive could imagine. Now someone was digging into those buried secrets. After 3 millennia of perfect silence, the past was beginning to bleed through the carefully constructed lies that held the Confederation together. Veltar activated his personal communication device and began issuing orders to his most trusted agents. If humanity truly had survived their exile and returned to Confederation space, then the galaxy was about to face its greatest crisis since the founding of their empire. The ghosts were coming home. The prison facility on Keth 7 appeared as nothing, more than a dark speck against the red surface of the forgotten moon. For over 2,000 years it had operated in complete isolation, its automated systems maintaining the complex without any contact from the outside galaxy. The Confederation had built it during the height of their war against humanity, then simply abandoned it when the conflict ended. Captain Minho led his infiltration team through the facility's outer defenses with practiced silence. Their advanced stealth suits made them invisible to the ancient security sensors, and their weapons could cut through the old barriers like paper. They expected to find empty corridors and rusted machinery, the typical remains of a long-dead military installation. Instead, they discovered something that stopped them in their tracks. The central habitat dome was alive with activity. Hundreds of people moved through the corridors, following daily routines that seemed to have been programmed into their very souls. They wore simple gray uniforms and spoke in quiet, measured tones as they went about their tasks. But something about their faces made Minho's heart race with impossible hope. Medic Sujin knelt beside one of the inhabitants, a young woman who had collapsed in fear when the strangers appeared. As Sujin examined her with gentle hands, her breath caught in her throat. The bone structure, the eye shape, the way the woman's hair fell across her shoulders, all unmistakably human. "My God," Sujin whispered, her voice filled with wonder and horror. "They're human." The infiltration team spread through the facility, discovering the truth that the Confederation had hidden for millennia. Generation after generation of human prisoners had lived and died within these walls. Their children raised by automated systems that had systematically erased their knowledge of Earth and their true heritage. The facility's computers had taught them only Confederation standard, fed them only approved foods, and programmed them to follow daily schedules designed to keep them docile and compliant. Minho approached a group of the inhabitants, his heart pounding as he prepared to attempt something that might change everything. He took a deep breath and spoke a single word in Korean, the ancient language of his ancestors that had been preserved in humanity's hidden archives during their long exile. "Annyeonghaseyo," he said softly. "Hello." The effect was immediate and startling. Every person within hearing distance stopped moving, their eyes widening as if they had heard something from a half-remembered dream. An elderly man stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion and sudden, inexplicable emotion. I know that sound, the old man stammered in Confederation standard. It feels familiar, like something my grandmother used to whisper when she thought no one was listening. Min-ho continued speaking in Korean, reciting simple phrases about home, family, and freedom. With each word, more of the inhabitants gathered around him, their faces showing the awakening of memories buried so deep they had become genetic echoes. Children who had never heard their true language began to weep without understanding why. Adults touched their hearts as ancient emotions stirred within them. "We are your family," Min-ho told them, switching back to Confederation standard so they could understand. "We are the children of Earth, and we have come to take you home." The rescue operation that followed would be remembered as the moment when humanity truly returned to the galaxy. As Min-ho's team evacuated the prison facility, loading the confused but willing survivors onto their transport ships, word of the discovery spread through underground communication networks across dozens of worlds. On distant planets, resistance fighters who had spent their lives fighting Confederation oppression suddenly heard whispers of the ghost species, the legendary humans who had once brought the mighty empire to the very edge of total defeat. The archived fragments that Taiman had leaked began to take on new meaning as proof that the impossible was possible, that even the Confederation could be beaten. In the hidden command center of the massive dreadnought Resurrection, Fleet Admiral Dong-wook received Min-ho's urgent transmission with hands that trembled from more than age. Around him, the bridge crew of the flagship fell silent as they listened to the impossible news. Survivors had been found, living descendants of the humans who had been captured during the war 3,000 years ago. "All ships, prepare for fleet activation," Dong-wook commanded, his voice carrying across the communication channels to hundreds of vessels hidden in the dark spaces between stars. "After 3 millennia of exile, we are going home." Throughout the vast armada that humanity had built during their long banishment, ancient engines that had waited patiently for this moment began to hum with power. Ships larger than cities, prepared for their first movement in centuries. Weapons, systems that had been maintained by generations of engineers came online for the first time since their construction. The Ghost Fleet was awakening, and with it, the hope of every oppressed species in the galaxy. The children of Earth had survived. They had grown strong in exile, and now they were returning to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The Confederation had erased humanity from history, but history was about to be rewritten by the very people they thought they had destroyed forever. The war was beginning again. At exactly 3 a.m, Galactic Standard Time, every communication device across the Confederation received the same message. From the busiest trade stations to the most remote frontier worlds, the words appeared on screens, echoed through speakers, and flashed across emergency broadcast systems with unstoppable force. "We are the children of Earth. We remember what you forgot." Supreme Chancellor Colden was awakened in his private chambers on Nexus Prime by the urgent sound of his emergency communicator. His aide stood trembling in the doorway, her face pale with fear as she handed him the report that would change everything. "Sir, the message has reached every system in Confederation space," she stammered. "Our technicians cannot trace its origin or stop its transmission. It appears to be broadcasting from everywhere at once." Colden read the simple words with growing horror. For 3,000 years, the Confederation had maintained perfect control over galactic history. The humans were supposed to be extinct, their civilization nothing more than a whispered legend among the oldest security officials. Yet here was proof that they had not only survived, but had returned with technology advanced enough to penetrate every defense the Confederation possessed. Within hours, the real nightmare began. Human archaeological teams appeared on dozens of worlds, using advanced equipment to uncover battlefields that had been deliberately buried and forgotten. On Kreshva, they revealed the remains of massive fortifications, where human and alien forces had made their final stand against Confederation invasion fleets. On Mordai, they uncovered mass graves filled with the bones of civilians who had refused to surrender their freedom. But the archaeological discoveries were only the beginning. The humans had brought with them something far more dangerous than weapons or technology. They had brought the truth. Ancient monuments that had been destroyed or hidden began to reappear, restored to their original glory by human engineering teams working with impossible speed and precision. Memorials to fallen. Resistance fighters emerged from beneath Confederation propaganda centers. Statues honoring heroes who had died fighting for freedom stood once again in public squares where they had been toppled centuries ago. Most devastating of all, the humans began broadcasting the real historical records. Using their advanced communication technology, they transmitted archived footage, documentary evidence, and personal testimonies that showed the galaxy exactly how the Confederation had built their empire through conquest, genocide, and systematic historical suppression. On Velka, Prime, citizens gathered in stunned silence around public viewing screens as they watched recordings of their ancestors fighting desperately against Confederation forces. The peaceful integration they had been taught to celebrate was revealed as a bloody conquest that had cost millions of lives. Children who had grown up singing songs of gratitude to their Confederation liberators learned that those same liberators had murdered their great-grandparents. The planet Gentar experienced similar revelations as humans broadcast evidence of the final battle that had taken place in their system. The inhabitants discovered that their ancestors had fought alongside human forces in a desperate last stand, holding off 3 Confederation battle fleets long enough for refugee ships to escape to unknown regions of space. The natural disaster that had supposedly devastated their world was actually the result of Confederation orbital bombardment designed to break the resistance. Taemin, now a wanted fugitive from his own government, worked secretly with human intelligence agents to coordinate the release of suppressed archive materials. From hidden locations across the galaxy, they transmitted classified documents that proved the systematic nature of Confederation historical manipulation. The evidence showed that hundreds of species had suffered the same fate as humanity. Their cultures destroyed, their histories erased, their very existence forgotten by design. The impact was immediate and explosive. On 47 worlds, populations that had lived their entire lives believing in Confederation benevolence suddenly remembered the truth about their conquered ancestors. Resistance movements that had been dormant for centuries sprang back to life, using tactical doctrines and strategic principles learned from the newly revealed human archives. On Kethmore, factory workers discovered that their industrial complex had been built on the ruins of their ancestral capital city. They rose, in revolt, using guerrilla tactics that the humans had perfected during their own resistance war. On Velnath, entire military units defected when they learned that their training facilities stood where their people's temples had once reached toward the sky. Kolden watched his empire crumble as report after report reached his command center. His aide's hands shook as she read the latest intelligence summaries, her voice barely a whisper as she delivered news that seemed impossible to believe. "Sir, we have confirmation of armed resistance on 47 worlds and counting. The rebel forces are coordinating their attacks using communication methods we cannot intercept or jam. They appear to be receiving direct tactical support from human military advisors." The Chancellor stared out the window of his office at the city below, where Confederation citizens were beginning to gather in the streets. Even on Nexus Prime, the heart of his empire, people were starting to ask questions about the truth they had been denied for so long. As he watched his carefully constructed world begin to collapse around him, Cole then made a decision that would determine the fate of every living being in the galaxy. If the Confederation could not erase humanity from history again, then they would have to erase history itself. The final weapon was about to be unleashed. Deep beneath the surface of the Confederation's massive capital ship, the Kronos engine hummed with power that could reshape reality itself. The weapon occupied an entire deck of the vessel, its quantum field generators stretching like metallic mountains through corridors that had been built specifically to contain energies capable of rewriting the fundamental nature of existence. Director Feltar stood before the main control console, his ancient hands moving across displays that showed the weapon's charging progress. After 3,000 years of keeping the truth buried, the Confederation faced its greatest crisis. The humans had returned, and with them came the power to destroy everything the Empire had built through lies and historical manipulation. Kronos. Engine at 60% power, reported the chief technician, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. All quantum containment fields are stable. We should reach full operational capacity within the hour. Veltar nodded grimly as he watched the energy readings climb higher. The Kronos engine was the Confederation's ultimate weapon, developed in absolute secrecy over centuries of research into the nature of time and memory. If successful, it would not simply kill the humans, it would erase them from the past itself, deleting not just their species but the very concept of successful resistance from galactic consciousness. But unknown to Veltar, humanity had spent their 3 millennia of exile preparing for exactly this moment. Light years away, aboard the human flagship Resurrection, Admiral Dongwook watched his tactical displays with calm determination. Every human ship in the galaxy was connected through quantum communication networks that existed outside normal spacetime, allowing them to coordinate their actions instantaneously across vast distances. "All vessels report ready, Admiral," announced his communications officer. "Quantum memory cores are synchronized and fully charged." Dongwook had anticipated that the Confederation would eventually resort to temporal manipulation. While their enemies had perfected the art of making people forget, humanity had spent 3,000 years learning how to remember. Every human ship carried quantum memory cores, advanced storage devices that could preserve information even when reality itself was being rewritten. The moment the Kronos engine reached full power, the battle for the soul of the galaxy began. Reality rippled like water as the weapon activated, sending waves of temporal energy across the stars. On world after world, the engine began systematically deleting events from history. Battles that had taken place were suddenly erased from time. Heroes who had died fighting for freedom simply never existed. Entire civilizations that had resisted Confederation rule were retroactively absorbed into the Empire without conflict. But each time the engine changed the past, humanity's quantum memory cores detected the alteration and immediately restored the original timeline. The result was catastrophic. Competing versions of history began to exist simultaneously, creating paradoxes that tore at the fabric of spacetime itself. On Velka Prime, citizens experienced the impossible sensation of remembering two different versions of their world's history at the same time. In one timeline, they had peacefully joined the Confederation. In another, their ancestors had fought a desperate war against the invaders. The contradictory memories caused mass confusion as people struggled to understand which version of their past was real. The quantum paradoxes spread across the galaxy like a virus, affecting every world touched by the Kronos engine's reality-altering field. Space itself began to buckle under the strain of sustaining multiple conflicting timelines, creating tears in the dimensional fabric that threatened to consume entire star systems. Veltar watched in growing horror as his weapon began to overload. The quantum containment fields that held the engine's power were never designed to handle the feedback created by humanity's memory cores. Warning alarms screamed throughout the capital ship as the reality-warping energies grew beyond all control. "Sir, we're losing containment," shouted the chief technician. "The paradox cascade is feeding back into the engine itself. If we don't shut it down immediately, the entire weapon will collapse." But it was too late. The Kronos engine had become caught in a loop of its own making, constantly rewriting history only to have those changes immediately reversed by the human memory cores. The weapon that had been designed to erase humanity from existence instead became trapped in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. The final explosion was not one of fire or energy, but of pure truth. As the Kronos engine collapsed in on itself, its reality-altering field expanded uncontrollably across the galaxy. Instead of erasing memories, the dying weapon began broadcasting them, not just human memories, but the suppressed recollections of every species that had ever lived under Confederation rule. Across 1,000 worlds, beings who had forgotten their true histories suddenly remembered everything. They recalled not just their own past, but the memories of their ancestors, their neighbors, and everyone who had ever suffered under the Empire's lies. The collective weight of 3 millennia of suppressed truth crashed down on the galactic consciousness like a tidal wave. The Confederation did not fall in battle or surrender in defeat. It simply ceased to exist as the lies that held it together evaporated under the weight of universal remembrance. When the quantum storms finally cleared, Admiral Dong-wook found himself standing in the restored archives of what had once been the Confederation capital. Beside him, Taemin worked to establish the new Galactic Historical Preservation Society, surrounded by scholars from dozens of species who had volunteered to help rebuild the true history of their galaxy. History belongs to those who refuse to let it die, Dong-wook said quietly as he watched the sunset paint the liberated city in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, the galaxy began the long process of healing from 3,000 years of enforced amnesia. The children of Earth had come home at last.